In recent political and economic discussions, the notion of industrial policy has celebrated its comeback globally and also in the European contexts. While neoclassical or neoliberal economy and economics didn't favor it, it is possible to observe an increasing relevance of this set of economic policies. The study 100 Shades of the EU argued that the EU and its peripheries need a real industrial policy as a strategy for both the EU and its peripheral member states. In today's episode, we will talk about the future of industrial policy in the context of the European Union. What does it encompass? And what are opportunities and challenges of industrial policy in the EU? How could industrial policy help EU peripheries to find more balanced economic development? Our today's guest is an Italian economist and co-author of the 100 Shades of the EU study, Giuseppe Celi. Welcome to the next series of interviews dedicated to the situation in the EU peripheries, which is related to our study 100 Shades of EU. And as already announced, we are going to talk today about very important and very actual topic of industrial policy in the peripheral countries of the European Union more specifically. And I'm very happy that I can invite, and my invitation was accepted by an Italian economist and co-author of our study 100 Shades of EU, Giuseppe Celi. Welcome, Giuseppe, to our talk. I would like to ask you first question, which is related to industrial policy, and I'm supposing that not everybody knows automatically what does it mean, even it became buzzword these days. So could you explain us what actually industrial policy means and what it involves?
Yes, thanks. Thanks for this question. This question would require a long discussion on what industrial policy means, but I try to be concise. Yes, and industrial policy usually refers to a broad area of intervention that government authorities can undertake to guide and control the process of structural transformation of an economy. And the basis assumption is that the process of industrialization plays the leading function in the whole process of transformation of the economy. So by acting on this process of industrialization, it's possible to direct the more general mechanism of a country's structural change. And in this broad sense, industrial policies are connected with the establishment of the modern state and the emergence of capitalism. Indeed, it's with the development of capitalism that the ability to organize production becomes the wealth of nations, and the expansion of production, in fact, determines power relation between first and social groups, changing relation between social classes inside the country, and changing relation between countries outside. The American economic historian David Landes, that Veronika know very well, in his work The Unbound Prometheus, recalls, for example, that the King of Prussia, in response to England's rapid industrial expansion, carried out a series of interventions to accelerate the development of the country's industry, feeling that an economic dependence on the new English industrial power became political subordination to England. So economic subordination becomes political subordination. And but approaching more recent times, in post-Second World War, from a theoretical point of view, the concept of industrial policy has undergone profound change. We can say that this change has followed the rise and fall of the so-called development economics. Development economics flourished in 1950 and developed until the 1970s. And this school of thought emphasized, for example, with the analysis of Gerskenkron or Hirschman, three important things. First, the difficulties that latecomers, lagging economies, may have in catching up processes. Second, the existence of more than one development path, not only the path of first-comer countries, advanced countries like UK or USA, that are the ideal type of development. There are a plurality of development paths. And third, the need for an active role of the state in conducting industrial policy, also in the choice of strategic sector to promote. And since the early 1980s, development economics changed in nature, following the dictates of the Washington Consensus. Now, according to the new conventional wisdom, in brackets, state intervention is never a good thing, because the self-regulation of market always ensures that there is an optimal allocation of resources. Only in rare case can state intervention be justified, only when markets fail to produce the social optimum, for example, due to some form of externality. Think, for example, about pollution, in this rare case. But the norm is that the state intervention is not necessary. So the state only has to ensure that competition has to work properly. So industrial policy, therefore, can only be competition policies, according to Washington Consensus. Despite this seemingly new but essentially old conventional wisdom, and academia itself effectively abolished industrial policies for more than 30 years, industrial policy, beyond the rhetoric, has continued to enjoy a very real and lively existence within the industrialized country, albeit under the radar. Just think that Margaret Thatcher herself, the champion of neoliberalism, for years generously financed sectors such as agriculture or energy. So rhetoric is very different now from the real world. So that's a point.
Okay, then of course the logic question is, when it was still existing, but it was under the radar, as you said, why is now the industrial policy returning as a pronounced strategy in the European Union?
Yeah, as I said, the emergence of Washington Consensus since the 1980s has essentially abolished the notion of industrial policies, transforming it into competition policy, also especially in the EU. According to this view, no strategic sector should be privileged because the self-regulation market in itself per se guarantees the best allocation of resources. So the state must not interfere in market mechanisms. But after 30 years of deliberate and often ideologically motivated neglect, industrial policy is again in fashion, both in academia and in the real world. Why? After the phase of neoliberal hyperglobalization, we know that three global structural shocks occur in a relatively short period span of time, 15 years. The 2008 crisis, the pandemic, and now the war in Ukraine. This shock have shown that the neoliberal policies of market deregulation pursued for more than 30 years have resulted in unsustainable imbalances that require state intervention and therefore the rehabilitation of industrial policy. And the third shock in order of time, the war in Ukraine, the more recent shock, has recently shaken the global geoeconomic political context, increasing uncertainty, generating stagflation, and undermining global value chains. And in this situation, the structural transformation related to the necessary reshaping of global change, for example, decoupling, international trade by separate blocks, or the strategy of reshoring, the repatriation of activity before relocated abroad, or friendshoring and nearshoring, the shortening of value chain, all which are strategy alternative to the hyper globalization that we have known until recent time, but especially the acceleration of energy and ecological transition, also triggered by the war, will require robust public investments, no? According to me. So industrial and fiscal policy are the main instrument, no, to rely in order to overcome, for example, cross-sectoral production bottlenecks, which were also at the root, for example, at the recent inflationary crisis, no? So especially in Europe, which is not a problematic Europe because it's polarized between core and peripheral country, but it's also Europe that is vulnerable globally in some key areas, such as electric transition, digital and green technology, where it suffers from the dominance of China and the United States. No, so that's all.
Yes. So when we now move, because our study was about EU peripheries, and we were emphasizing the importance of the new industrial policy for these countries, I would like to ask you, in which direction actually these two regions, we remind everybody that we were studying basically Southern Europe and Central East European countries. So here I would ask you which structurally, which sectors would be best developed under the new industrial policy, and how to have this regional look like, which sectors in Southern Europe and which sectors potentially in the Central East Europe.
Yes. So first, regarding the Southern European countries, no, we know that these countries, after the industrialization phase that took place between the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the 1970s, suffered a slowdown or even interruption of industrialization process, no, in the following decades. And the following process of financialization of the economy that affected also Southern European countries, the same process of financialization played an important role in determining a production structure that was excessively unbalanced toward the service sector, no, in the case of Southern European countries. So the liberalization capital movement that took place at the end of 1980s and continued during the transition process toward the new European Monetary Union coexisted with the dismantling of industrial and development policies, with heavy repercussion in terms of distortion of the productive structure of Southern European countries. So, and a common trend of these countries was that of the gradual progressive withdrawal of the state from strategies of control and direction of the allocation of resources, of financial resources, leading to a shift in the productive structure of this country towards more volatile activities, no? With short-term returns at the detriment of more solid productive activities, like industrial activities with longer-term returns. No? So this led to the diversion of finance from industry to construction, commercial hypertrophy of commercial distribution and consumption, privatization, market concentration, and the growing importance of foreign actors in banking sector, increased exposure in the formation of the bubbles, no? Especially in construction sector. Today, therefore, we see that Southern European countries rely on sectors such as tourism, catering, hospitality, sector that also become crucial in adjusting the balance of payment of these countries, no? Are very important to sustain, no, the balance of payments of this country. But unfortunately, we have seen how this disproportionate shift of the productive structure of these countries toward this sector, no, tourism, catering, as I say, was fatal when the pandemic arrived, no, the coronavirus arrived. So these countries have also been severely hit by the coronavirus due to their unbalanced production structure toward services, particularly affected by the measure to contain the contagion, no? In the case of South European countries. So, in my opinion, these countries should overcome, no, the excessive imbalance toward volatile activities such as tourism. And industrial policy then becomes an important instrument to rebalance the production structure of this country, not necessary to relaunch an export-led growth model, considering the difficulties associated with the current global geoeconomic political context. And Trump's recent victory, moreover, no, for a shadow of an escalation of trade wars through tariffs. No? Instead, I think of an industrial policy that can serve to relaunch the domestic market, not the internal market of these countries. So to this purpose, we can also think of investments that can meet social needs, which have been severely penalized by the austerity policies that followed the 2008 crisis, and which have made the impact of the pandemic even more severe as a consequences, for example, for the cuts in healthcare, no? Especially in South European countries, which were particularly severe in the case of these countries. So we can therefore think of an industrial policy for these countries that goes in the direction of also boosting investment in social infrastructure, no? Healthcare, education, housing, and so on. So, which are particularly relevant in the strategy aiming to expand, no, the internal markets. And a particularly significant example in EU is that of long-term care systems, no? For example, because population aging in itself, per se, may undermine the growth and innovation potential of the economy, but the expansion of formal long-term care services, no, private or public, home-based or community-based, has a large and unexplored potential, especially if it relies on a parallel expansion of assistive digital technology. No, in fact, actually, long-term care is an illustration of a thickening reinforcement of the proximity links between the provision of care services and the industrial sector. No, for example, biomedical, ICT, robotics, sensor. No. So actually, it represents a context in which customization, no, is crucial, and therefore proximity between demand and production is important. So if you want, no, this strategy can be seen as an example of the shortening of the value chain, no, in difficult times of geopolitical tensions, no. But it is also a virtuous example of industrial strategy that combines expansion in employment, because long-term care is a labor-intensive activity, no, and expansion in value-added innovation for the use of digital technology, robotics, biomedical apparatus, and so on. No, so this could be a possible strategy, no, for industrial policy in this country. But I think that, so this is for South European countries, but I think that a strategy of sectoral diversification and domestic market expansion should also be indicated for Central and Eastern European countries, no? Because we know that FDI and export are the key drivers of economic development of these countries, no? And however, even the robust industrial development of the most dynamic Central East European countries, the Visegrad economy, no, that have expanded the industrial base thanks to their incorporation into Germany's value chains, also this country presents serious element of fragility, no? We know dependence on foreign capital and technology, limited domestic market, and hypertrophy of export with respect to GDP, no? Low wage and more specialization in car industry. So recently, the energy shock represented by the war in Ukraine has severely challenged countries with a concentration of employment in energy-intensive sector. In Europe, these countries are mainly Germany and the Visegrad countries, no? Countries that, as I said, also have a high concentration of employment and value added in automotive sector, a sector that is facing the challenge of the electric transition and that is suffering heavily from competition from China. No? In Germany, the automotive sector, and not only, is in severe crisis because Volkswagen is even closing some production plants, no, in Germany. And given the strong production complementarity between the German industry and that of Central Eastern European countries, the car crisis also having serious repercussion on Eastern European countries. No? So this is another reason to pursue an industrial policy in these European countries that aim at production diversification and domestic market expansion. No? I think so. So I think that this country should seriously rethink their development model based on export and dependence on FDI, no? Because the export-led model itself seems ill-suited to cope with a changing geoeconomic environment in which the international trade itself is weaponized, no? With countries that control raw materials, intermediate inputs, and key technology and are ready to exert, no, their power. No? And wage moderation, the compression of domestic and public demand, and the absence of incentives to diversify production, which are the building blocks of the export-led model, which are the building blocks of the development model of Eastern European countries, don't seem suited to the new global context, no, I think. So I believe that industrial policy for Eastern European countries should also aim at production diversification and domestic market expansion. That is all, yes.
Okay, then the last question, which I think is also important, maybe if you could explain how these peripheral national governments should maneuver the space between these interests which you spoke about and priorities of industrial policy and the EU policy, because we know now was published the Draghi report. Before that, there are other initiatives related to industrial policy in the EU. And we also know, and we have criticized quite largely the approach of the European Union, meaning the Brussels Center to do policies one size fits all. And that's, we know it doesn't work specifically for the peripheral countries because they have these all possible vulnerabilities, different structure problems, and so on. So how to maneuver between these two policies in this context for peripheral countries in the EU?
Yes, I start with an overview of the vulnerability of Europe on the whole in the global context, and then some consideration about the vulnerability in terms of polarization inside, no, the EU. So Europe's disadvantage in technology competition, no, with the United States and China in some key areas, no, such as semiconductors or green technologies, has been widely documented, no, in recent years. Faced with the emergence of an aggressive global competitor such as China, which has deployed massive state funds to support particular strategic sector, no, semiconductors, lithium-ion batteries, solar panel, etc. Some signs of a possible change of pace in the conduct of its industrial policy have been coming from the EU. No? Actually, with reference to the EU role in the global context, some analysts have highlighted or, in some cases, advocated its recent metamorphosis from a neutral player, no, with a mainly regulatory and market-oriented attitude to a geoeconomic player with a propensity towards strategic autonomy. And actually, in the space of few years, there have been a series of initiatives of the European Commission that seems to aim, at least on paper, at a sort of technological sovereignty. In 2020, for instance, the new industrial strategy launched by the European Commission announced the goal of preserving European competitiveness and strategic autonomy in times of geopolitical appeal. And in the very context of the next generation, we know that in the next generation EU Recovery Fund, 20% of the total allocation is reserved for strengthening the resilience of strategic sector related to the digital and ecological transition. And these initiatives were complemented by other projects. For example, the IPCEI, the acronym is Important Project of Common European Interest, project aimed at facilitating large-scale European projects in strategic value chains as green infrastructure. And other recent proposals, such as REPowerEU, Fit for 55, and the EU Chips Act, enrich this framework of European Commission initiative for energy autonomy, climate neutrality, and digital transition. And finally, very recently, in response to the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA of USA, the EU attempted to design a green industrial policy aiming at improving the competitiveness of the European industry at net zero emission. This green industrial plan has been translated into a legislative proposal, the Net Zero Industry Act. So, in other words, this proliferation of projects, designed to strengthen certain strategic sector, would seem to foresee an actual discontinuity with the type of industrial policy that EU has pursued in past years. An industrial strategy based on level playing field regulatory standard and horizontal intervention, so competition, essentially competition policy, very different from the quantitative and qualitative firepower developed by the selective intervention that have characterized the industrial strategies of countries such as the United States and China. So the question is, how should this apparent radical change in new industrial policy be assessed and evaluated? Will this plethora of initiatives that I mentioned succeed in narrowing the technological gap between the EU and other global competitors? What lesson can the EU learn in terms of selective industrial policy intervention from the experienced country like China, where massive state intervention in guiding and direct investment in certain sectors is at the antipodes of competition policy, very different from competition policy, which is still present in Europe, a policy carefully calibrated by a supranational institution, European Union, to maintain neutrality among member states. If we consider, for example, the industrial strategy in semiconductor sector, which is of crucial importance for the digital, electrical, and ecological transition, is the steel of the 21st century. The EU Chips Act promised, in the bracket on the paper, to mobilize 43 billion euros, which is a figure in some way comparable to that allocated by the United States with the Chips and Science Act, which is the US equivalent of EU Chips Act. But the similarity in the monetary scale of the two plans, however, should not overlook the fact that USA already start from a position of undisputed leader in the sector, especially in the science segment of semiconductor. And if we look at China, on the other hand, for almost a decade, the Chinese state has mobilized more resources than any other country in the semiconductor industry, roughly $150 billion. no, with the goal of overcoming technological dependence on foreign countries and achieving manufacturing self-sufficiency. Therefore, in the global context of chip production, especially with respect to strong competitors like USA and China, we have to ask what position and what possible industrial policy strategy the EU will be able to envisage. Considering that some countries like the United States and Taiwan dominate the segment, the high-end segment, the segment with higher value added, design and fabrication, and others, such China, have even excess production capacity in those segments with lower value added, assembly, production of low-end chips, memory card, etc. So, what is the role of the EU in this competition? According to some analysts, the EU Chips Act should focus on the design segment and related R&D activities. But I think that this recommendation, this recommended direction, has two drawbacks. No? First one, this strategy could widen the gap with the EU between countries already endowed with the technology cluster necessary to develop a design segment, like Netherlands, and less endowed countries. No? So in this way, widening the core periphery divergence. No? Second, specialization oriented toward the high value added segment, as suggested by some analysts, in the semiconductor supply chain, would expose the EU more to the risk of bottlenecks resulting from geopolitical conflicts, because actually some European countries, such as Germany, by continuing to have strong economic relations with China, could even incur the restriction applied by USA, the entity list, for example. So, on the front of semiconductor production, the perspectives are not easy for the EU, I think. No? On the energy and ecological transition front, with the REPowerEU plan, the European Union proposes three fundamental objectives: energy saving to be achieved through greater efficiency, an acceleration in the use of energy from renewable sources and resources, and diversification of energy supplies. But even in this area of industrial policy intervention by the EU, a number of critical issues emerge, according to me. The first concern is that at present, the EU is highly dependent on raw materials that are crucial for the energy transition. No? For example, in the case of the input needed for lithium-ion batteries, the EU internally extracts only 1% of its needs, and processes a modest 8% domestically. And it's clear that the new European energy strategy will create new dependencies, as new production chain will develop. And in this process, so the policy of supply diversification, so the substitution of energy imported from Russia, for example, will become particularly important, and therefore we require being well calibrated and sustainable. For instance, with reference to the strategy of increased use of green hydrogen, the EU cannot limit itself to all extractivist model vis-a-vis less developed countries, by thinking that it can import raw materials without limits. Instead, the EU will also have to take into account the development needs of less advanced countries by establishing mutually beneficial and sustainable relationship over time. For example, there are countries like Egypt or Morocco that are investing a lot in hydrogen, but not to export this resource, but to develop eco-friendly industry, for example, in fertilizer. So we have to respect also the need of less development countries, I think. Second, as already pointed out in the case of digital transition, even in the process of replacing fossil fuel and advanced green technology for the use also of renewable energies, there could be further divides between core and periphery in Europe. No, why? For instance, in the case of the transformation of biomass into bio-based products, such as biofuels, no, for example, which is important strategy to develop a bioeconomy for Europe. In agenda of European Commission, there is a strategy for bioeconomy in Europe. No, so but if you look at the map of biorefineries in Europe, you can say that they are already concentrated in Central and North European countries that, not by chance, are the same countries that tend to attract larger and better funded smart specialization projects in the context of EU programs, no? Horizon 2020, Fifth for 2055, REPowerEU, and so on. So the EU, from the perspective of digital and ecological transition on the whole, is vulnerable in the global context, but is also polarized inside between countries with different capability to carry out necessary structural transformation. So we have seen that three dramatic shocks have disrupted the socio-economic fabric of European countries, especially peripheral ones. However, the latest shock, the war in Ukraine, has this time affected both core and peripheral countries. No? The energy crisis has dramatically affected both, for example, both a core country like Germany, but also a peripheral country like Italy. No? In addition, this time, the war-related crisis fall heavily on energy-intensive industry and not only on services, as in the case of the pandemic crisis. No? And so the powerful German manufacturing platform extended to the Visegrad country is particularly affected by this shock, no? The war in Ukraine. So with a crisis, faced with a crisis that indiscriminately affects both core and periphery, the route cannot be that of austerity policy carried out in isolation, as was the case in response to the 2008 financial crisis. The path should be the one traced by the Next Generation EU. No? The first example of debt mutualization in the EU. And for example, common funds could be used to finance a collective energy policy aimed in the short run at replacing energy imports from Russia, and in the long term at accelerating the transition to renewable sources. And also the recent Draghi report suggests going in this direction. And Draghi proposed the relaunch of industrial policy with a massive amount of investment to strengthen the European industry. And this is good. Finally, the importance of looking at the real economy and not only at financial parameters is expressed even by a member of the European establishment who has played an important role in the conduct of European monetary policy. Even from Draghi. So, but Draghi's approach is predominantly to look at Europe as a whole, which has to compete with rivals such as the United States and China in a global context. And however, it seemed to me that Draghi's perspective turns out to be less attentive to the rebalancing of productive structure between European countries. A rebalancing that should aim to reduce core-periphery divergence. Draghi speaks of scale economies, which underlie concentration processes. And it would be quite paradoxical if even the European Green Deal, on the paper a progressive, innovative, and potential rebalancing strategy in Europe, ended up widening core-periphery divergence. This would be the case in particular if the European Green Deal were to take the form of a top-down strategy, in which funds for green conversion were to be concentrated on large corporations and multinationals. Therefore, if bigness were to lead the green transition game, by concentration fund on mega projects endorsed by European Commission, the risk of replicating the core periphery model, even in the process of European economic recovery driven by green technology, become probably impossible. I think. Okay, that's all.
So actually, it would be great if the policymakers in the EU peripheral countries would listen what you said now, that there are these risks and that the polarization within the EU is maybe continuing because of this ill-made policies with concentration of industrial policy. However, I think this was very good informative interview, and I thank you, Giuseppe, for your time.
It's a pleasure to.
And we will say goodbye to our listeners and look forward some other interview in the future.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Yeah. Thank you. You too. Bye.